And welcome as we get into another example of programming here. Specifically, let's look at how we can use derived classes in an example. So what I did is I went ahead and created a pet class here. And we can see we have a very basic class. We, of course, have a string here for our name. We have age, weight, and days at shelter. So these are here, of course, are our variables. And we have a couple different constructors here. We have a no-arg constructor. We have a name-only constructor. We have one that's more of an attribute constructor because you see we have the name of the pet, the age of the pet, and the weight of the pet. And then I have more of a fully parameterized one, so one that's using every variable here. So I have the name, age, pet, and days at, referring to, of course, this shelter.java class. So we're going to go ahead and build this out here. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and create these other two classes. Now, everything else that's in here is things that we're familiar with. Get methods, set methods, toString methods, and we'll look at all those in turn at how they get worked through with the derived classes. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and give you an example of how this works. So if I look at my dog class, all right, if you look right now, it just says public class dog. Now, the thing about this class right now, if I leave it as is, this class technically exists on its own, but what I wanted to do actually is I want it to be an extension of the pet class. So I'm just going to add the keyword extends pet. And what that's going to do now is it says that dog is now a derived class of pet. And because it's a derived class of pet, it now has all these properties here that belong to the pet class. So it now can have a name, it can have an age, a weight, days at shelter, and all the corresponding methods. And if we look at cat, you'll see this exact same thing. We do, of course, have a new boolean here that just like with dog is puppy or is kitten. But let's go ahead and extend the pet class here. So extends pet. And again, that's going to make this into a derived class. So it's that easy to make a derived class. Now, of course, there's a little bit more nuance, as we're going to see when we actually make a couple constructors here. And we will take some time to dive into how to build all these different constructors and pieces as we look at these. But for now, let's just go ahead and see this in practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my dog class here. I'm going to start with the no-arg constructor. So if I look at my no-arg constructor here for pet, I'm just going to go ahead and just copy this just so I can have it for a reference here. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter a few times, paste it in just so I can reference it so I don't have to go back and forth here. So we know if we have a no-arg constructor, we're going to start with the public keyword. And we're going to start with the name of the class, so public dog. And if I go ahead and put that in, that's going to be the exact same as what I expect. Now, if I want to pull in these variables, all right, there's going to be a word that we are going to get familiar with, which is this super invocation. Now, the problem with this one is that with this super invocation, you'll notice it's wanting things for itself. So if I just say super, this is going to say 8. This is a super invocation, and it needs to match whatever I have up here. So if I have a no-arg constructor, my super invocation needs to also be a no-arg constructor. Now, the reason why I brought this in here is just so we can kind of see why these are working the way they are. So here with dog, with this pet one, we have a no-arg constructor, but it should bring in all these different pieces here. So we should have a name, an age, a weight, and days of shelter, all initialized to these kind of empty values. I'm going to go ahead and take this one back out here. And let's go ahead and look at this with a parameterized version. Now with the parameterized version, if we look at the fully parameterized version of the pet class, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that one on over. And let's just bring this down. We're going to use this kind of as our inspiration for the dog. So let's do public dog. And now this is where we're going to get a little interesting because we want this to match the number of parameters here. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and put this in here and just put my super invocation again. But again, how many parameters do I have? I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to make sure that these parameters are going to match. So let's just do string name, int age, int weight, int days at. All right, and now these, of course, are existing as parameters that are part of this dog. So you see you have 4 different parameters that should be passing in. Now, what if we wanted to pass these values to here? All right, so the super invocation should be pulling in these other values. So if I said, for example, I want to pull in the name, age, the weight, and days at, you'll notice that it will then accept those as values, which is pretty cool. Now, the one thing we could run into is how those values, of course, are handled by the parent class here. So if we look at how pet handles them, it could cause us some issues down the line. But just for getting things set up, this is perfectly fine. Now I do want to go ahead and add a couple other methods here just to show. Now this one says determines if it is a puppy or not. So this is a Boolean method, so we could make this public or we could make it private depending on how we want to implement this in our program. So for example, we want to say, is it a puppy? And all we're going to do, we're just going to say like return, and we're just going to look to see is the age of the puppy pretty much a certain value. So it says below 12 months. So in order to do that, I need to look back at my pet. Is there something I can use to get the age of the pet? Which I do. I have something called get pet age. So if I use get pet age in here, all right, I can put that in here, and then I can compare that to 12. So if I say that is less than 12, that should, of course, return true. And that's a very quick, easy helping method. Now, if I look at the toString method that we have here, I'm just going to copy over the existing one, because what we're going to do is we're going to override this. And we're going to talk about overriding methods in our next lesson. But I'm just going to go ahead and put this in here. Just copy and paste this in here. And you can see, of course, it's got a couple things that are already screaming at us. So the reason for this is because name, if we look, this is a variable that doesn't exist within dog, but it does exist within pet. Now, because it's private, I can't access that variable. So instead, I have to switch to using methods. So I'm going to change this to my get name or get pet name method. And just like age would have to be switched to my get pet name or pet age method. And so on and so forth. And you can start seeing the pattern of how this is going to work a little bit if you have any kind of idea with programming of how these different things work. And if you don't get it, that's okay, because we're going to take time to kind of dive into and look at these different pieces. There we go. And now this, of course, toString is exactly the same as what we had here in pet, except now we have to use these invocations here. All right, we have to use the get methods here because, again, those variables exist in pet but not in dog. Now I could add in one more thing here because remember this is just a giant string here. I could add in another string that says, for example, and the dog is a puppy, or is the dog a puppy? That we can frame it as a question for my Boolean. And then I could just concatenate that with is puppy. All right. Now, we can do the same thing here for cat, and I'm not going to fill that one out for you. You can always go here and add these in. You can see they'll function very much the same. But let's just go ahead and demo this here with a quick dog object. So let's go ahead and create a new dog object. So let's just call this dog. And let's give it a name. So dog is Charlie, and we're going to make him a new dog object. And let's just go ahead and do a parameterized version of this dog object, just to make it simple today. So let's go ahead and call him Charlie. And we want to give him an age, so let's say he is 15. We'll give him a weight, we'll say he's at 60 pounds. And let's say he's been at the shelter for 5 days. Now if I want to go ahead and test this, if I want to do anything with it, I can then use the methods I've created in here to go ahead and check them. So for example, I could do a systemout.println that could check to see if he's a puppy. So Charlie.isPuppy. But you notice if I do this one, you see that we get an error here because with isPuppy, remember, it's not visible because we made it private. So this one would actually not be visible unless we change this from a private to public. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and remember, I put this in my toString method. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and change this to my toString method. And now that we have that set, if we run our code, we can see if everything is working correctly. So if I run this, we get the name of the pet is Charlie. They are 15 months old, weigh 60 pounds, and have been in the shelter for 5 days. And is the dog a puppy? False. All right, because we know that Charlie is more than 12. And that's all that's to being able to work with the derived class. Again, we're going to go through these, how to build all these different pieces in here. So I don't want you to stress over it too much. If you want to challenge yourself, you can, of course, think, how can I go ahead, if I did this for dog, how can I do this for cat? Because it's pretty much going to be the exact same thing, except here you can see we do have a small variance. We were looking for below 3 months old. And how do these different parameterized versions factor into things? How does this super constructor truly work? We kind of get an idea of it here. But again, we're going to go ahead and take a couple lessons here to really dive into the different parts of how to build these derived classes so that by the time you're done, you're going to be an expert.